Emily hummed along to the radio as she pulled into the driveway of her new townhouse, the keys to her first home jingling in her hand. After years of renting, the 28-year-old marketing manager had finally taken the plunge and purchased this charming two-bedroom unit in the quaint Maple Grove community. As she stepped out of her car, Emily couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. The townhouse was everything she had dreamed of: a modern, open-concept layout, a cozy private patio, and a pristine, well-manicured neighborhood. This was going to be a fresh start, a chance to put down roots and truly make a space her own. But just as Emily was about to head inside, a shrill voice stopped her in her tracks. Well, if it isn't the newest resident of Maple Grove, the voice dripped with condescension. Emily turned to see an imposing woman striding towards her, her lips pursed in a tight, disapproving frown. "You must be." Emily racked her brain, trying to remember the details from the stack of HOA paperwork she had skimmed through. "Karen, the president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association." The woman introduced herself, her tone leaving no doubt about the importance of her position. "And I must say I have some concerns about you moving in." Emily felt her stomach drop. She had heard the rumors about the Maple Grove HOA and its infamous president, but she had hoped they were exaggerated. Now, face to face with the formidable Karen, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of trepidation. "Concerns?" Emily asked cautiously. "I've reviewed all the HOA guidelines, and I'm committed to being a model resident. I want to be a positive addition to the community." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Well, that remains to be seen," she said icily. "Maple Grove has very high standards, you see. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain aesthetic, and I'm not convinced you have what it takes to live up to those standards." Emily felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and indignation. "I can assure you I take great pride in my home and my property," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I'll do whatever it takes to be a good neighbor and follow the rules." We'll see about that," Karen replied, her lips curling into a thin, humorless smile. "I have my eye on you, Emily. One wrong move, and you'll be hearing from me." With that, she turned on her heel and stalked back down the street, leaving Emily feeling unsettled and uneasy. As she watched Karen's retreating figure, Emily couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. This was not the warm, welcoming community she had envisioned. Instead, it felt like she had been thrown into the middle of some kind of power struggle, with Karen positioned as the gatekeeper and Emily as the unwitting challenger. Emily took a deep breath, trying to push aside her worries. She was determined to prove herself, show Karen and the rest of the Maple Grove HOA that she was a responsible, conscientious homeowner deserving of their respect. With a renewed sense of purpose, she headed inside, already mentally planning all the ways she could make her new house a true home. Little did she know, her battle with the tyrannical HOA president was only just beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of unpacking boxes, hanging artwork, and getting settled into her new home. Despite Karen's ominous warning, Emily did her best to stay under the radar, diligently following the HOA guidelines to the letter. She mowed her lawn on schedule, kept her flower beds neatly trimmed, and dutifully wheeled her trash cans to the curb every Monday morning by 7 a.m. sharp. But try as she might, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever she stepped outside, she would catch glimpses of Karen peering at her from behind the blinds of her immaculate white colonial, that same disapproving frown etched on her face. Then, one fateful Monday morning, disaster struck. Emily's alarm had failed to go off, and by the time she stumbled outside, coffee in hand, the trash collection had already come and gone. Her cans sat forlornly on the driveway, their contents untouched. "Oh no," Emily groaned, panic rising in her chest. She quickly wheeled the cans back to their designated spot, her mind racing. She knew the HOA had strict rules about this, fines were issued for any infractions, no exceptions, and given Karen's apparent vendetta against her, Emily had no doubt the HOA president would pounce on this opportunity to make an example of her. Sure enough, just 2 days later, a crisp white envelope arrived in Emily's mailbox. She tore it open, her heart sinking as she read the contents. "Notice of violation. Failure to remove trash cans within a specified time frame," the header proclaimed in bold letters. And below, the fine amount that made Emily's blood run cold, $400. "$400?" she exclaimed, her voice echoing in the empty townhouse. "For leaving my trash cans out for a few extra hours?" Seething with outrage, Emily immediately fired off an email to Karen, pleading her case and requesting a waiver of the exorbitant fine. But the HOA president's response was as chilly as a Siberian winter. "The rules are the rules, Ms. Wilkins," Karen wrote back, her words dripping with barely concealed triumph. "I'm afraid I cannot make any exceptions, no matter how inconvenient they may be for you. Perhaps next time you will be more diligent in following our community guidelines." Emily stared at the screen, her fingers trembling with fury. This was no mere misunderstanding. It was a blatant act of retaliation. Karen was clearly out to get her, and she was using the HOA's draconian policies as a weapon. Determined not to back down, Emily decided to take her case directly to the HOA board. Surely the other members would see the absurdity of the situation and intervene on her behalf. So, with a renewed sense of purpose, she marched off to the next scheduled HOA meeting, ready to plead her case. But from the moment she stepped into the community center, Emily knew she was fighting a losing battle. The other board members, all of whom seemed to have been handpicked by Karen, regarded her with thinly veiled disdain, and when she rose to address the room, the HOA president cut her off, loudly admonishing Emily for her blatant disregard of the rules. "The fine stands," Karen declared, her voice brooking no argument, "and if you continue to defy our guidelines, Ms. Wilkins, I can assure you there will be even more severe consequences." Feeling utterly humiliated, Emily stormed out of the meeting, tears of frustration staining her eyes. She had come to this community hoping to put down roots and build a life, but instead she found herself trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare, at the mercy of a power-hungry tyrant and her minions. As she drove home, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe this wasn't the fresh start she had envisioned after all. Perhaps it was time to cut her losses and find a new place to call home, one where she wouldn't have to constantly watch her back for the dreaded HOA Karen. Over the next few months, Emily's tense standoff with the Maple Grove HOA and its president, Karen, only seemed to intensify. Despite her best efforts to toe the line and follow every rule to the letter, the violations and fines kept piling up. One day, it was a sternly worded notice about her mailbox color being the wrong shade of beige. The next, a hefty fine for allowing her dog to bark for an excessive duration during the designated quiet hours. Emily found herself constantly on edge, her nerves frayed as she scrutinized every aspect of her home and property, terrified of running afoul of the HOA's draconian regulations. The final straw came when she received a citation for having a single leaf remain on her driveway for more than 24 hours after the weekly landscaping service. This time, the fine was a staggering $500. "This is utterly ridiculous," Emily fumed, crumpling the notice in her hand. "How can they possibly justify these outrageous penalties?" Determined to fight back, she decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, intent on standing up to Karen and her cronies once and for all. As she stormed into the community center, her heart pounding, Emily could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room upon her. Karen, of course, was the first to pounce. Well, if it isn't our favorite rule breaker," the HOA president sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. "I was wondering when you'd show your face around here again." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm here to appeal these ludicrous fines," she declared, her voice quavering slightly despite her best efforts. "The punishment simply doesn't fit the crime, and I refuse to be treated like a criminal in my own home." The other board members exchanged dismissive glances, clearly unimpressed by Emily's outburst. Karen, however, seemed to relish the confrontation, her eyes gleaming with a predatory sort of glee. "Oh, but my dear Emily, you seem to be under the mistaken impression that these are simply fines," the HOA president purred, her lips curling into a cruel smile. No, these are penalties, consequences for your flagrant disregard of our community guidelines." Emily felt her stomach twist into knots as Karen continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "You see, we have very high standards here in Maple Grove, standards that you have repeatedly failed to meet, and I, as the president of this association, have a duty to ensure that every resident upholds those standards, no matter the cost." The other board members nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening into masks of disapproval. Emily felt her face flush with humiliation, her heart pounding in her ears as she struggled to find the words to defend herself. But I've done everything I can to follow the rules," she protested, her voice cracking. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, I just want to be a good neighbor." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment Emily could have sworn she saw a glimmer of triumph in the older woman's gaze. "Then perhaps you should try a little harder, Ms. Wilkins," the HOA president said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Because if you continue to defy us, I can assure you that the penalties will only continue to mount." With that, Karen turned to the rest of the board, effectively dismissing Emily. The young homeowner stood there, dumbfounded, as the meeting proceeded without her, her pleas for understanding falling on deaf ears. Humiliated and defeated, Emily stormed out of the community center, tears of frustration and anger streaming down her face. She had come to this neighborhood hoping to put down roots and build a life, but instead she found herself trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare, at the mercy of a power-hungry tyrant and her minions. As she drove home, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe this wasn't the fresh start she had envisioned after all. Perhaps it was time to cut her losses and find a new place to call home, one where she wouldn't have to constantly watch her back for the dreaded HOA Karen. Over the next several months, Emily's life became an endless cycle of battling the relentless onslaught of HOA violations and fines. It seemed as though every time she turned around, Karen and her cronies had discovered some new way to target her, each infraction more absurd and outrageous than the last. A purple mailbox flower, $200 fine. Her dog barking during the quiet hours, $300 penalty. A single leaf left in the driveway for more than a day, a jaw-dropping $500 charge. Emily felt like she was drowning, the fines piling up so quickly that she could barely keep track. Her bank account dwindled, and she found herself constantly on edge, her nerves frayed as she scrutinized every inch of her property for potential violations. It's like they're just making these rules up as they go. She would vent to her few sympathetic friends, who could only offer commiserating shrugs and words of encouragement. I'm doing everything I can to be a good neighbor, but it's never enough for Karen and her cronies. To make matters worse, Emily noticed that the other Maple Grove residents seemed to be largely complicit in the HOA's tyrannical reign. Whenever she tried to raise her concerns at community events, the other homeowners would either avert their gaze or mumble vague platitudes about maintaining property values. They're all just terrified of crossing Karen, Emily realized with a sinking feeling. No one wants to risk her wrath, even if it means standing up to her blatant abuse of power. Desperate for a solution, Emily pored over the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loopholes or technicalities she could exploit. But the guidelines were written in the sort of impenetrable legalese that only a seasoned attorney could navigate, and Emily felt hopelessly outmatched. The final straw came when the latest violation notice appeared in her mailbox, informing her that she owed the Maple Grove HOA a staggering $4,000 in accumulated fines. Emily stared at the document, her hands trembling, as the realization sank in that she was now facing a crippling financial burden, all because of a few minor infractions and one vindictive HOA president. I can't keep doing this, she whispered, her vision blurring with tears of frustration and defeat. I just can't. Feeling utterly hopeless, Emily made a decision. She would have to move. There was simply no other choice. The fines had become too much to bear, and she couldn't bear the thought of living under Karen's constant scrutiny and harassment any longer. But just as she was about to start searching for a new home, a glimmer of hope appeared. A coworker casually mentioned that a local news station had been running a series of investigative reports on abusive HOA practices, and Emily felt a spark of determination ignite within her. Maybe, just maybe, she could fight back. If she could get her story out there, expose the Maple Grove HOA's tyrannical tactics to the wider public, perhaps she could force them to back down. It was a long shot, to be sure, but at this point, Emily was willing to try anything. Mustering her courage, she reached out to the news team, sharing the harrowing details of her battles with Karen and the HOA. To her surprise, the reporters were immediately intrigued, and within a matter of days, a camera crew was on her doorstep, ready to document her plight. As Emily recounted her story, the anger and frustration she had been bottling up for months came pouring out. The journalists listened, their eyes widening with each shocking revelation, and Emily knew that she had finally found her chance to fight back. With the news report scheduled to air in the coming days, Emily felt a sense of cautious optimism begin to take root. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn the tables on the tyrannical HOA and its ruthless president. After all, knowledge was power, and she was about to give the entire community a hefty dose of it. The day the news report on Emily's battle with the Maple Grove HOA aired, the small suburban community was thrown into an uproar. The story, which detailed the young homeowner's relentless harassment at the hands of HOA President Karen and her draconian enforcement of the association's guidelines, quickly went viral, sparking outrage and heated discussions across social media. Suddenly, the spotlight was shining brightly on the once sleeping neighborhood, and the residents of Maple Grove found themselves thrust into the center of a heated public reckoning. "I can't believe this is happening in our community," one shocked neighbor exclaimed, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and indignation. I know Karen can be a bit strict, but I had no idea she was this bad." Another resident, a middle-aged man who had lived in Maple Grove for over a decade, shook his head in disgust. "It's a disgrace, that's what it is," he spat. "Those fines are nothing but a blatant abuse of power. I always knew that HOA was run like a dictatorship, but this takes it to a whole new level." The damning news report painted a vivid picture of Emily's plight: the relentless onslaught of violations, the crushing financial burden of the ever-mounting fines, and the humiliation she faced at the hands of the unyielding Karen. Viewers were outraged, their sympathies firmly on the side of the embattled young homeowner. And as the story continued to make the rounds, the residents of Maple Grove found themselves forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many of them had been complacent, even complicit, in allowing Karen's reign of terror to go unchecked. "We should have spoken up sooner," one woman admitted, her face etched with guilt. "But we were all just so afraid of rocking the boat, you know? Karen has this way of making you feel like you're the one who's wrong, no matter what." Another neighbor, a retiree who had lived in the community for over 2 decades, nodded in agreement. "That's the thing about these HOAs. They're set up to keep the residents in line, to make you feel powerless. And Karen has taken that to the extreme." Suddenly, the once docile Maple Grove residents were stirring with a newfound sense of outrage and determination. The idea that one of their own had been so ruthlessly targeted and abused by the very institution meant to serve them had struck a nerve, and they were no longer willing to remain silent. "Enough is enough," a young mother declared, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "We have to do something about this. Karen can't be allowed to get away with this anymore." And so a groundswell of resistance began to take shape, as neighbors who had once meekly accepted the HOA's harsh edicts now banded together, determined to challenge the status quo and hold Karen accountable for her actions. Meanwhile, the embattled HOA president found herself facing an entirely different kind of battle, one that played out not in the shadowy confines of community meetings, but in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. As the news report continued to make the rounds, Karen found herself the target of intense media attention and community backlash. Her once ironclad authority began to crumble, as residents who had once trembled at the mere mention of her name now openly questioned her tactics and demanded change. Suddenly, the tables had turned, and the once untouchable HOA president found herself on the defensive, forced to confront the growing chorus of voices that condemned her abuses of power. For Emily, the surge of public support and outrage was both heartening and bittersweet. After months of feeling isolated and powerless, she now found herself at the center of a growing movement, one that had the potential to challenge the very foundations of the Maple Grove HOA's tyrannical reign. But as she watched the drama unfold, Emily couldn't help but wonder what the endgame would be. Would the residents' newfound defiance be enough to finally topple Karen and her cronies? Or would the HOA president find a way to cling to her power, no matter the cost? Only time would tell, and Emily was determined to see this fight through to the bitter end. As the media spotlight continued to shine brightly on the Maple Grove HOA and its embattled president, Karen found herself increasingly cornered and desperate. The public backlash had been swift and unyielding, with residents from across the community openly condemning her heavy-handed tactics and demanding accountability. For the first time in her tenure as HOA president, Karen was no longer the untouchable dictator, wielding absolute power over the neighborhood. Instead, she found herself thrust into the uncomfortable position of having to defend her actions, her once ironclad authority now crumbling under the weight of the public's outrage. "This is an absolute disgrace," one angry homeowner shouted during a heated community meeting, his face flushed with rage. "Karen has been terrorizing us for years, and we just sat back and let her do it. Well, no more. It's time for her to answer for her crimes." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, their cries of agreement drowning out Karen's feeble attempts to interject. The once formidable HOA president sat there, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line, as she watched her carefully curated image of authority and control unravel before her eyes. Sensing the tide turning against her, Karen knew she had to act fast, and in a surprising move, she made a proposal that left Emily and the entire community stunned. "I understand that many of you are upset about the situation with Ms. Wilkins," Karen began, her voice surprisingly calm and measured, "and I want to take this opportunity to offer a resolution that I believe will be satisfactory to all parties involved." The room fell silent, the tension palpable as every pair of eyes turned towards the HOA president. "I am willing to personally pay the $4,000 in fines that Ms. Wilkins has accrued," Karen announced, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. if in exchange she agrees to drop her complaint and refrain from any further public commentary about the HOA and its policies. Emily felt her jaw drop, her mind reeling at the unexpected offer. After months of relentless harassment and abuse, the very woman who had tormented her was now dangling a potential solution, one that would absolve Emily of her financial burden, but at the cost of her silence. The other residents erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and whispers, their expressions a mix of shock and skepticism. Karen sat there, seemingly unfazed by the reaction, her eyes fixed intently on Emily. "Well, Ms. Wilkins?" the HOA president prompted, her lips curling into a faint, triumphant smile. "What do you say?" Emily felt the weight of the room upon her, every pair of eyes now trained on her, waiting with bated breath for her response. On one hand, the offer was tempting. The prospect of having the crippling fines wiped away, of finally being free from the constant threat of Karen's retribution, was undeniably appealing. But on the other hand, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was all a calculated ploy, a desperate attempt by Karen to regain control of the narrative and quash the growing resistance against her. And the prospect of being silenced, of having to bite her tongue and accept the HOA's abuses, filled her with a deep, simmering rage. After a long moment of contemplation, Emily steeled her resolve and fixed Karen with a steely gaze. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Karen," she said, her voice measured and unwavering, "but I'm afraid I can't accept it. This isn't just about the fines or even about me. It's about exposing the corruption and abuse of power that has been happening in this community for far too long." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, and Emily could see the triumph on Karen's face begin to crumble, replaced by a look of undisguised alarm. "I will not be silenced," Emily declared, her voice rising with a newfound confidence. "And I will continue to fight against the Maple Grove HOA and its unjust policies, no matter the cost." The room erupted into thunderous applause, the residents erupting into a chorus of cheers and shouts of support. And in that moment, Emily knew that she had found her allies, a community of homeowners who were ready to stand up and fight alongside her, to challenge the tyranny of the HOA and its ruthless president, once and for all. Emboldened by the overwhelming show of support from her fellow Maple Grove residents, Emily wasted no time in turning the tide of the battle against the HOA and its president, Karen. In the days following her dramatic rejection of Karen's olive branch offer, Emily set to work rallying her neighbors, organizing a grassroots campaign to challenge the HOA's policies and leadership. She started by spearheading a petition to recall Karen from her position as president, arguing that the community could no longer trust her to uphold the association's duties in a fair and transparent manner. The response was immediate and impassioned. Homeowners who had once meekly accepted the HOA's edicts now flocked to sign the petition, eager to lend their voices to the fight against Karen's tyrannical reign. Within a matter of weeks, Emily had amassed well over the required number of signatures, setting the stage for a decisive showdown at the next community meeting. As the highly anticipated gathering approached, the tension in Maple Grove was palpable. Karen, sensing the tide turning against her, had pulled out all the stops in a desperate attempt to cling to power, flooding the neighborhood with a barrage of mailers and door-to-door canvassing, warning residents of the dire consequences that would result from her removal. But Emily and her allies were undeterred. They took to social media, sharing their stories of HOA abuse and rallying support from the wider community. They held rallies and town halls, giving homeowners a platform to voice their grievances and demand change. And when the day of the community meeting arrived, they showed up in force, their numbers swelling to the point where the cramped community center could barely contain the crowd. As Karen took the podium, her usually imperious demeanor betraying a hint of unease, Emily stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. "Residents of Maple Grove," she began, "we are here today to reckon with the corruption and abuse of power that has plagued our community for far too long. For years, we have been subjected to the tyrannical rule of our HOA president, Karen, who has wielded her position like a weapon, trampling on our rights and our dignity with impunity." The crowd erupted into a chorus of cheers and applause, the din punctuated by the occasional boo or hiss directed at the increasingly agitated Karen. "But today," Emily continued, her eyes blazing with determination, "we say enough is enough. We are here to demand accountability, to challenge the unjust policies that have divided us and diminished our quality of life. And we are here to vote, to remove Karen from her position and install new leadership that will truly serve the best interests of our community." As Emily stepped back, the residents erupted into a deafening roar, their chants of "Recall Karen! Recall Karen!" echoing through the room. Karen, her face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic, scrambled to regain control of the situation, but her pleas for order were drowned out by the sheer force of the crowd's collective outrage. In the end, the vote was decisive. With an overwhelming majority, the residents of Maple Grove stripped Karen of her position as HOA president, paving the way for a new era of transparency and accountability within the community. As the dust settled, Emily found herself the reluctant hero of the hour, her once solitary fight against the HOA's tyranny now transformed into a triumphant battle cry for change. Homeowners from across Maple Grove flocked to her, offering heartfelt thanks and pledging their support for her continued efforts to reform the association. "You've given us our power back," one elderly resident told her, his eyes shining with gratitude. "We owe you a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid." Emily, humbled by the outpouring of support, knew that this was only the beginning. The HOA's deep-rooted problems would not be solved overnight, and she was prepared for the fight to continue. But with the community firmly on her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination, a conviction that together they could build a better, fairer Maple Grove, one that would no longer be beholden to the whims of a power-hungry tyrant. As for Karen, the former HOA president vanished from the public eye, her reign of terror finally over. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the thought, tempered by the knowledge that the battle had been hard won, and that the scars it had left would take time to heal. But for now, she was content to savor the victory, to bask in the knowledge that she had stood up for what was right, and that her community had risen to the occasion, ready to forge a new and better path forward. In the aftermath of the dramatic recall election that ousted Karen from her position as Maple Grove HOA president, Emily found herself elevated to the status of local hero. Her steadfast refusal to be cowed by the former tyrant's abuses of power and her tireless efforts to rally the community against the HOA's unjust policies had struck a chord with residents across the neighborhood. Suddenly, Emily was being hailed as a champion of the people, a symbol of the power of collective action and the triumph of justice over tyranny. Neighbors who had once eyed her warily or avoided her altogether now sought her out, offering profuse thanks and expressing their gratitude for her courage and determination. "You've given us our voice back," one elderly resident told her, his eyes shining with emotion. "We can't thank you enough for standing up to that horrible woman and her cronies." Another homeowner, a young mother of two, embraced Emily warmly, tears streaming down her face. "I was so afraid of Karen and the HOA, but watching you fight back, it's inspired me to be braver, to stand up for my family." "You're a true hero, Emily." Overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, Emily found herself grappling with a newfound sense of purpose and responsibility. The battle against the Maple Grove HOA's tyrannical reign had been hard-fought and bitterly won, but she knew that the work was far from over. With the former president Karen now relegated to the shadows, the residents were eager to usher in a new era of transparency and accountability within the association. Emily, drawing on the momentum of her victory, spearheaded a series of sweeping reforms, working closely with the newly elected HOA board to overhaul the organization's policies and procedures. Gone were the draconian fines and the opaque, unilateral decision-making that had characterized Karen's tenure. In their place, the HOA implemented a more inclusive democratic process, with regular community forums and open communication channels that empowered homeowners to have a meaningful say in the affairs of their neighborhood. But Emily's influence extended far beyond the boundaries of Maple Grove. Inspired by her story, homeowners from across the region began reaching out to her, seeking advice and guidance on how to stand up to their own abusive HOAs. It was then that Emily realized she could do even more to effect change, not just in her own community, but on a broader scale. Determined to lend her voice and her expertise to the growing movement against HOA tyranny, Emily founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal aid and advocacy for residents facing unfair fines, restrictive covenants, and other forms of HOA overreach. The Homeowners United for Fair Play quickly gained traction, attracting supporters and volunteers from all over the state and beyond. Through her work with the organization, Emily became a prominent figure in the ongoing battle against HOA abuses, sharing her story and offering strategies and resources to empower other homeowners to stand up for their rights. She testified before state legislatures, lobbied for HOA reform legislation, and even appeared on national news programs, bringing the issue of HOA tyranny to the forefront of the public consciousness. As for Karen, the former Maple Grove HOA president retreated into obscurity, her reign of terror finally over. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the thought, tempered by the knowledge that the battle had been hard won, and that the scars it had left would take time to heal. But in the end, Emily's victory was not just her own, it was a triumph for the entire Maple Grove community and for homeowners across the country who had long suffered under the yoke of HOA oppression. Her story had become a rallying cry, a testament to the power of collective action and the unwavering determination of the human spirit. And as Emily looked out over the transformed Maple Grove, a neighborhood now defined by a spirit of unity, empowerment, and civic engagement, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was her legacy, the lasting impact of her hard-fought battle against the HOA's tyranny, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that it was only the beginning.